When a first-century prophet saw the risen Lord in a vision, he described a figure with eyes like blazing fire and a voice like rushing waters, an image of final, unquestioned authority. Revelation 1. Fast forward 3 centuries, and the church faced a very different problem. Mortal men, scattered across cities and provinces, trying to order the life of Christian communities in a world that had only just begun to call itself Christian. The Council of Laodicea, the secret rules the church erased from history, asks a blunt question. What happened when local leaders tried to legislate the church, and why do some of their decisions seem to have vanished from the record? Were rules quietly erased, or did history simply move on? Picture a city in the Lycus Valley, Laodicea, not a capital, not an imperial court, but a thriving provincial center where bishops met to settle practical matters. This council, convened in the late 4th century, approximate dating is indefinite in some sources, produced a set of norms meant to govern worship, clergy conduct, and the moral life of congregations in its region. Over time, a handful of those norms stopped being generally observed, and in modern retellings, this lapse sometimes gets spun into tales of suppression or deliberate erasure. The reality is messier, rooted in the limits of local authority, the fragility of manuscript transmission, and the long, uneven process by which the church's common practices were formed. Before we go further, if this subject matters to you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. This series will walk carefully through the texts, the manuscripts, and the theology, so you can see how decisions made in a provincial city centuries ago still raise questions for the church today. Imagine the wider stage. The Roman Empire after Constantine had become a world where Christian institutions were expanding fast. Theological disputes, Arians, semi-Arians, and a host of local controversies made order a pastoral necessity. Bishops gathered in local synods to address immediate problems: heretical teaching in a neighborhood, disorderly conduct among clergy, confusion about which texts to read in the assembly, or uncertain practice about feasts and fasts. Local synods were not ecumenical councils. They had no universal jurisdiction. They were pragmatic. How to keep worship coherent, protect the reputation of clergy, and shepherd the faithful in ways that fit the city's life. That practical character explains much of the council's content. Laodicea's canons, fragments and references of which survive in later canonical collections and citations, focus on everyday matters: the ordering of the liturgy, constraints on clerical behavior in public and private life, limitations on participation in Jewish festivals, and guidance on what the people should hear read in worship.
These are not grand doctrinal pronouncements. They look less like imperial edicts and more like a parish handbook for a late antique bishop. Manyhook, here's what the priests were told to stop doing, and why that mattered. But we must be careful about how we speak of these canons. Some later manuscripts and church writers preserve lists and canons associated with Laodicea, yet the survival of a text in a medieval manuscript does not automatically prove the precise content or authority of a 4th century synod. Where manuscripts agree, historians have more confidence. Where they diverge or appear only centuries later, our certainty fades. In those cases, the correct scholarly posture is to label the claim indefinido and to weigh probabilities carefully. One of the most contested issues tied to Laodicea concerns the list of sacred books. Several later compilations include a so-called Laodicean list that notably omits the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. For some readers today, that omission seems explosive. Did a council once declare Revelation non-canonical, and was that decision suppressed? The evidence, however, is not so straightforward. Manuscript traditions are complex. Lists circulated regionally, and absent a single ecumenical decision, local lists could and did differ. Some scholars argue that the Laodicean list reflects a local preference or an editorial mistake in a later copy, rather than a deliberate act of exclusion by the synod itself. Others suggest that the status of Revelation was genuinely disputed in parts of the East for centuries. The correct reading is careful. Whether Laodicea formally excluded Revelation is indefinido, in the sense that the documentary trail is ambiguous and interpretations vary among competent historians. Manyhook, one list of sacred books circulated, but did it mean what later generations assumed? Beyond the canon question, several thematic clusters of rules emerge from the material commonly associated with Laodicea. Each cluster tells us something about the pastoral priorities of its bishops. Liturgy and the rhythm of worship. Several canons emphasize the ordering of communal worship. They instruct when reading should occur, who may preside, and how the assembly should comport itself. A recurring concern is the distinction between Christian holy time and Jewish observance. The synodial materials urge Christians to observe Sunday as the primary day of assembly, not the Sabbath, and to avoid participating in Jewish festivals or fasting practices in ways that might blur Christian identity. How decisive were these rules beyond Laodicea? The short answer, local intent, broader resonance. Sunday observance did become normative across the empire, but that shift was not accomplished by a single local decree. It was the result of overlapping practices, imperial legislation, and pastoral teaching that moved in the same direction: clerical discipline and public comportment.
The canons also tackle clergy ethics, prohibitions against clergy engaging in certain secular trades, directives about clergy marrying or not marrying. Various regulations exist across different synods, and guidance about how clergy should appear and act in public. These rules reflect a pastoral impulse to protect the distinctiveness and moral credibility of leaders. Again, their force was often local, a rule useful in Laodicea, where bishops worried about clergy balancing market commerce and ministry, might be irrelevant in another city. Public reading of Scripture. Who chose the readings heard on Sunday? Which books were read in the assembly? Canons attributed to Laodicea address the public reading of Scripture and favor a core set of texts for liturgical use. That raises the perennial question: does liturgical use equal canonical status? Historically, the two overlap but are not identical. A book may be read frequently in worship in one region before its universal acceptance, and conversely, some widely read theological texts never achieved canonical standing. The Laodicean concern with readings reflects pastoral choices about what the congregation needed to hear for formation and instruction, not necessarily a final judgment about every disputed text. Lay practice and social behavior. Several rules address the conduct of lay Christians: fasting days, participation in civic rituals, and social boundaries with non-Christians. These were pragmatic regulations designed to prevent scandal, to clarify what a Christian household looked like, and to foster community cohesion. They are pastoral, not prophetic. They reveal a church learning to live together under new social and legal conditions. For each of these themes, we must ask, what is the documentary basis? Some canons are cited in multiple later sources and can be correlated across manuscripts. Such items have a firmer claim to authenticity. Others appear only in isolated collections or as second-hand references in later compilations. These are indefinitive. Where evidence is scant, modern interpreters sometimes fill the gaps with plausible narratives, but plausible is not the same as proven. Mini-hook. If they really tried to erase something, what would they have had to erase? The answer may surprise you. So why did some of Laodicea's rules fade from practice? Several overlapping factors explain the selective survival of norms. First, the local nature of synodal authority. A provincial synod could legislate for its region. It did not by itself create universal law. Practices that solved problems for Laodicea might be irrelevant in Alexandria or Rome. Over centuries, local customs either adapted to broader consensus or remained confined to their provinces and eventually ceased to be remembered beyond them. Second, manuscript transmission and preservation. The survival of a canon in our day depends on scribes, collectors, and the accidents of history. Texts copied and recopied in thriving scriptoria stood a better chance than those confined to a single diocese. A canonical list preserved only in a late, isolated manuscript cannot command the same weight as a list attested across multiple early witnesses. When medieval compilers assembled canonical books, they sometimes conflated, reorganized, or misattributed texts, so the absence of a rule in later collections sometimes reflects these transmission dynamics rather than an intentional erasure. Third, the evolution of liturgical life and imperial legislation. As Christianity became embedded in imperial structures, liturgical practice was shaped by broader forces: imperial decrees, influential bishops in major sees, and grassroots devotional habits. A local regulation could be superseded by new liturgical fashions or by the consolidation of practice under larger synodal decisions. The development of the canon was itself a long, cumulative process, reaching a more stable shape only by the end of the 4th century in some Western councils, for example Hippo and Carthage, and remaining subject to regional variation in the East for longer. That historical consolidation explains why some earlier local lists lost their currency. Bigger conversations ultimately set a common agenda. Fourth, interpretive projection. Modern readers sometimes project their own expectations back onto the past. A missing book in an obscure list becomes evidence of a grand conspiracy in a contemporary narrative, when a more modest explanation, scribal omission, local preference, or liturgical convention fits the evidence better. Avoiding this projection is a key discipline of historical theology. Where did the myth of erasure come from? Partly from the allure of a dramatic story. The idea that a rule once powerful enough to be recorded could be quietly expunged makes for gripping narrative. Partly from the selective citation of texts.
Quoting a late manuscript without context can lead listeners to assume that a council decisively legislated on matters that were actually contested or only regionally observed. And partly from the understandable frustration of modern readers who want neat, universal answers in a history that often offers ambiguity and slow development instead. It helps to map the difference between a local canon and an ecumenical decision. An ecumenical council, recognized across broad parts of the Church, carried weight precisely because its proceedings were widely circulated and enforced by major sees and occasionally imperial authority. Local councils like Laodicea dealt with immediate pastoral needs. Their reach ended where their influence and communication ended. Over time, some local practices spread and became universal. Others quietly receded. None of this requires a secretive conspiracy. The passage of time, the contingencies of copying, and the consolidation of authority in larger centers are often sufficient.
Mini hook. The mechanisms of forgetting are prosaic, not conspiratorial, but they have shaped memory all the same. Let us return to the canonical list question with an eye for evidence. Certain medieval manuscripts preserve lists that are labeled or associated with Laodicea, and that show variations from other lists. These variations include omission or inclusion of particular books, notably Revelation. Textual critics note that Revelation's early reception varied by region. It found defenders in the West, and some Eastern fathers were cautious. The manuscript evidence suggests real ambiguity in the 4th and 5th centuries. The critical point: to claim that Laodicea definitively excluded Revelation as an act of erasure is to overstate the surviving evidence. A more defensible claim is this: in some local lists associated with Laodicea's milieu, Revelation is absent or uncertain. The historical significance of that absence is indefinitive and requires careful engagement with the manuscript witnesses, their dates, and their provenance. This caution is not a refuge for skepticism, but an invitation to responsible historical practice. When the documentary trail is strong, we can speak with confidence. When it is fragmentary, we acknowledge limits and explore competing hypotheses. In the case of Laodicea, the consensus among many historians is that the synod issued practical disciplinary canons typical of a provincial council, and that later claims about erased rules often overreach the evidence. That consensus does not close debate. It simply urges scholars and interested Christians to weigh documents, context, and probability, rather than to leap to sensational conclusions. Theologically, how do we interpret this? The Church has always faced a tension between human authority and divine lordship. Scripture affirms Christ's supreme authority. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, Matthew 28:18, and the early Church looked to bishops and councils to exercise delegated order for the sake of God's people. When local leaders legislate, they must do so with humility, recognizing the limits of their jurisdiction and the provisional nature of many pastoral norms. Laodicea provides a vivid case study, a group of bishops attempting to answer concrete challenges of their day, producing rules that were pastoral, circumscribed, and sometimes ephemeral. Many hook. What does it mean practically when a rule is pastoral rather than doctrinal? Practical implications follow. First, Christians should be cautious in treating ancient disciplinary rules as immutable theological decrees. Some pastoral norms carry theological weight and have contributed to received practice. Others were context-specific solutions. Second, we should cultivate a historical humility. Recognizing how contingent many church practices are encourages charity toward traditions that differ from our own.
Third, the Church's unity and continuity ultimately rest on Christ and the apostolic witness, not on any single synod's technical rulings. Our job, both as scholars and as pastors, is to read the past carefully and to allow historical complexity to inform theological confidence, without dissolving it. At this point, the story widens and deepens. We have sketched why Laodicea matters, and why its supposed erased rules are usually better understood as the consequence of local legislation, transmission gaps, and later consolidation. Ahead lies a more exacting task: to examine the manuscript evidence closely, to compare the so-called Laodicean lists with contemporary lists, and to trace how later councils and influential bishops treated disputed texts and disciplinary norms. There is a single question that brings these strands together, and that demands our next attention. When a local synod's list differs from what later became standard, does that difference reflect theological rejection, regional preference, scribal error, or something else? The answer is rarely singular. In some cases, the divergence will point to a genuine local practice. In others, to manuscript corruption. In still others, to a broader period of uncertainty that only later generations resolved. To understand which is which requires moving from general patterns to concrete evidence, the actual manuscripts, the earliest citations, the liturgical lectionaries, and the way influential bishops referenced certain books. We will need to scrutinize a handful of key witnesses: the manuscript traditions that carry lists or canons associated with Laodicea, citations by late antique writers who either knew or allegedly used Laodicea material, and the record of later councils in North Africa and the Latin West that issued more widely recognized canonical lists. Only then can we weigh whether omissions were accidental, intentional, local, or universal in intent. As we prepare to examine those witnesses, keep in mind a guiding pastoral principle. Controversies over textual lists and disciplinary rules will always matter for theology and church life, but their historical resolution often requires patience with ambiguity rather than appetite for sensational certainty. History, like pastoral care, prizes truth shaped by evidence and charity. Now we stand at the threshold of the hard work, reading the surviving collections, comparing their headings and contents, and tracing how scribes and compilers treated Laodicea's material. Which manuscripts preserve Laodicea's canons? How do they label them? Which books appear in the lists they transmit? And where do those books appear in local lectionaries? These are the questions that lead us from plausible sketches into forensic historical analysis. The next step is to turn to the sources themselves, to the parchments, the marginal notes, the catalogs of bishops and councils, and to let their testimony, with all its imperfections, speak.
And as we do that, one further theological question presses upon us. What does the persistence or disappearance of a rule tell us about the nature of authority in the Church? Not only who issues rules, but how God's people recognize, preserve, and sometimes set aside those rules. The answer will shape how we live together across time, tradition, and theological difference. We will need to read the surviving collections, compare their headings and contents, and trace how scribes and compilers treated Laodicea's material. These are the questions that lead us from plausible sketches into forensic historical analysis. The next step is to turn to the sources themselves, to the parchments, the marginal notes, the catalogs of bishops and councils, and to let their testimony, with all its imperfections, speak. Begin with the manuscripts in the genres in which Laodicea's canons survive. The evidence arrives to us in more than one form: Greek canonical collections compiled in the Eastern Mediterranean, Latin translations in epitomes transmitted in the West, and occasional citations or echoes in patristic writings. None of these witnesses stands by itself. Each must be read in relationship to the others and to its date and providence. Broadly speaking, the kinds of witnesses are threefold. First, there are canonical collections, corpuses that gathered local synodal decisions into corpuses intended for ecclesiastical use. These collections often mixed material from different times and places, sometimes sewing a provincial list next to a metropolitan or imperial one. When a Laodicean canon appears in such a corpus, we must ask, is it presented as an original text of the local synod, or does a later compiler attributed to Laodicea for mnemonic or authoritative reasons? Second, there are lectionaries and liturgical books, the lists of readings churches used on particular Sundays and feast days. The presence or absence of a text in a lectionary tells us about liturgical acceptance rather than theological endorsement per se. Third, there are patristic citations, authors who quote or reference a rule, sometimes by name, sometimes by paraphrase. A clear quotation by an early author gives strong support for the existence and circulation of a rule in a certain time and place. An oblique echo or a later paraphrase requires more caution. To read these witnesses well, we must keep two guiding principles in mind. 1. Degree of attestation matters. A canon appearing in several independent early manuscripts has a stronger claim to authenticity than a rule found only in a single late copy. 2. Provenance matters. A text preserved in a Syrian monastery might reflect Syrian practice. A Latin version copied in Italy might preserve a Western editorial tradition. Mixing the two indiscriminately produces the very confusions that generate sensationalist claims.
Let us now turn from the generalities to concrete clusters of evidence, the specific kinds of canons commonly attributed to Laodicea, and examine what the witnesses actually show. For each cluster, I will summarize the content commonly associated with Laodicea, indicate the character of the surviving evidence, and mark indefinito where questions remain. 1.
Sabbath, Sunday, and the distinction of Christian time. One of the better attested emphases attributed to Laodicea concerns the proper observance of Christian time, especially the effort to distinguish Christian Sunday observance from Jewish Sabbath practices. The Laodicean materials that survive in canonical collections repeatedly urge Christians to gather on the Lord's Day and to avoid Judaizing practices that would blur Christian identity. In some formulations, the rule forbids Christians from resting on the Sabbath as the Jews do, while encouraging honoring the Lord's Day with assembly and reading. This instruction fits a broader late antique pastoral concern. After the conversion of many households and the new public visibility of Christians, local leaders wanted to assert distinctive rhythms. Evidence strength. Moderately strong for a pastoral rule prohibiting Judaizing forms of Sabbath observance in Laodicea's milieu. Such a rule appears in multiple canonical collections tied to the Eastern Mediterranean and accords with broader late 4th century patterns of drawing firm boundaries between Christian and Jewish practice. Historical qualification. Indefinito as to the precise wording and universal intent. Some transmitted versions are short and practical, others read like later editorial expansions. Scholars caution that where the texts survive only in later manuscripts, the original scope may be narrower than later readers assumed. Why this matters for the erasure question. A local synod's attempt to draw a line between Sabbath and Lord's Day could be influential in its region, without being decisive everywhere. Over time, Sunday observance did become normative across the empire, but not exclusively as a result of one council. The apparent disappearance of a specific Laodicean phrasing is explicable by regional diffusion and textual transmission, rather than by a deliberate campaign to expunge the rule. 2. Liturgical order and the public reading of Scripture. Several canons commonly ascribed to Laodicea concern the order of worship, who presides, how readings are arranged, which books are suitable for public reading. One recurring theme is a restriction on the reading in assembly of apocryphal or recently composed texts. The emphasis is on providing congregations with texts that edify and safeguard doctrinal integrity. A related cluster instructs that certain books should not be read in public liturgy, implicitly differentiating between devotional reading and canonical public proclamation. Evidence strength, mixed.
There are multiple testimonia showing that local synods regulated public readings. That is not controversial. What is more uncertain is the specific list of books that the Laodicean materials intended to restrict. Some medieval lists associated with Laodicea show a core group of texts recommended for liturgical use. Others present variations. When a list differs significantly from later canonical lists, there are several possible explanations. Local liturgical custom, scribal error in transcribing a heading, or a compiler's attempt to abbreviate a list for liturgical practicalities. Historical qualification, indefinitive regarding whether a particular Laodicean list functioned as a definitive canon or as a lectionary guide for public worship. The surviving materials suggest pastoral regulation rather than a final doctrinal act. Implication, liturgical selection is not identical to canonical judgment. A text excluded from public reading in one place could still be recognized as sacred in private devotional use, or even be accepted doctrinally elsewhere. This functional distinction explains why some texts were slow to receive universal liturgical acceptance, even while gaining theological recognition. 3. Clerical conduct, trade, appearance, and household life. The Laodicean material we possess addresses expectations for clericy, prohibitions against clericy engaging in certain commercial activities while fulfilling public ministry, instructions about not standing at marketplaces in clerical vestments, and caution about clerical spouses and household management. These regulations aim to protect clerical dignity, deterrence of scandal, and the separation of sacred duty from profane commerce. Evidence strength, fairly strong that local bishops in Asia Minor and surrounding provinces legislated on such matters. Comparable canons appear in other regional synods as well, which suggest common pastoral concerns rather than unique Laodicean innovations. Historical qualification, indefinitive as to the force of these rules across regions. In some places enforcement was strict, in others it was informal. The later medieval and early modern church often reinterpreted such canons to support stricter clerical discipline, sometimes anachronistically applying local pastoral measures as universal ideals. How this contributes to forgetting when urban economies, social expectations, and clerical roles shifted over centuries. For instance, when bishops accumulated greater resources or when parish structures changed, the practical relevance of certain restrictions diminished. A rule sensible in a market town setting might look odd and therefore be neglected in a different social environment, losing both practice and memory. 4. Lay practice, fasting, and civic ritual. Laodicean rules directed lay practice too: what days to fast, how to approach civic festivals and oaths, and how to relate socially with non-Christians without scandal.
The pastoral logic is evident. A newly public church needed guidelines for witness, communal identity, and the avoidance of syncretism. Evidence strength, moderate. Such regulations are common across episcopal decisions of the period and in different regions. Historical qualification, indefinitive regarding specificity. Often, the surviving phrases are schematic, leaving interpretation open. Later readers who encountered short directives sometimes expanded them into fuller legal formulations in canonical compilations. Mechanisms of forgetting. If civic festivals faded, or if imperial legislation changed the shape of civic religion, local rules about participation could become obsolete. Likewise, when social boundaries shifted, for instance through mixed marriages or urban migration, older rules could be reinterpreted or quietly set aside. 5. The canonical lists. Inclusion, omission, and ambiguity. Perhaps the most debated element associated with Laodicea is the appearance of a list or lists of sacred books. Some transmitted lists attributed explicitly or implicitly to the Laodicean milieu leave out certain books, most famously the Apocalypse. What should we make of these lacunae? Start with a map of the broader canonization process. The formation of the New Testament canon was not a single event, but a multi-generational process. In the West, the decisions of councils such as Hippo, 393, and Carthage, 397-419, and influential figures like Augustine helped stabilize a 27-book New Testament that included Revelation. In the East, the process was more gradual and regionally varied. Athanasius's Festal Letter of 367 lists 27 books and was influential, but other Eastern communities moved at different paces and emphasized different texts for liturgy and instruction. Now, the Laodicean offense. Several medieval manuscripts, themselves compilations sometimes centuries removed from the original synod, preserve lists that have been read by some modern observers as Laodicean. These lists show variation. In some witnesses, Revelation is absent from the set. In others, the list more closely matches later canonical forms. The plausible explanations are multiple and not mutually exclusive. Regional preference. Certain Eastern provinces were cautious about Revelation's liturgical use and did not incorporate it into lectionaries as readily as some Western churches did. Local lists may reflect that hesitation rather than an outright judgment. Scribal or editorial error. A list copied from or appended to a different collection might have lost an item in transmission. Scribes sometimes conflated lists or misread headings. Functional list rather than doctrinal canon. The list in a given manuscript might be a lectionary selection rather than a statement of theological canon. A book not commonly read in public could thus be omitted without being theologically suspect.
Evidence strength, indefinitive on whether Laodicea itself issued a definitive canonical list excluding Revelation. The manuscript evidence is ambivalent. Some lists in Laodicean contexts omit Revelation, but the explanatory reasons vary and are contestable. We cannot, on extant evidence, assert a definitive act of exclusion by the Council. A helpful comparison. Athanasius's 367 Festal Letter, Hippo and Carthage. These Western fixings of the canon in the late 4th century exerted influence, but they did not immediately erase regional differences in the Eastern provinces. The more gradual acceptance of a uniform canon in the East explains why some regional lists remain divergent for decades or centuries. 6. The afterlife of rules, transmission, compilation, and reuse. Why do some Laodicean canons vanish from later practice, while others endure? The answer lies partly in the ways manuscripts were compiled, copied, and reused. Medieval compilers assembled canonical collections for different uses. Some were reference toolkits for bishops, others were monastic handbooks, and still others were local capitularies. A Laodicean canon copied into a useful compendium might be widely transmitted if that compendium circulated. A rule confined to a provincial archive could be sealed by the fortunes of that archive. Later canonical collections sometimes rearranged, summarized, or even conflated canons from different councils. Where compilers were less scrupulous about provenance, attribution became muddled. A rule originally intended for Laodicea could be reattributed, expanded, or merged with a similar rule from another council. Another survival mechanism is citation by influential figures. When major bishops or churchmen cite a rule, they can breathe centuries of life into it. But when no prominent authority quotes a local canon, its circulation is vulnerable. Thus, the preservation of a rule often depends less on its intrinsic theological value than on accidents of transmission, who copied it, who admired it, and who had access to the libraries that preserved it. 7. The temptation of conspiracy and the discipline of indefiniteness. At this point, it is crucial to repeat a methodological caution. The human mind loves tidy explanations, a single villain, a single erasure, a single decisive act. But the late antique and medieval documentary landscape resists such simplicity. The mechanisms we have traced, Regional variation, scribal practice, liturgical difference, changing social contexts, and the selective interests of later compilers provide prosaic and well-documented explanations for the disappearance of particular formulations. When confronted with a manuscript omission, the responsible historian asks a chain of questions. What is the manuscript's date and provenance? Is it independent or derivative? Does some other witness preserve the same omission? Could the omission be functional rather than doctrinal?
Answers to these questions often point to contingency rather than conspiracy. Where evidence remains ambiguous, the correct posture is indefinito and a presentation of competing hypotheses with their probabilities. A case study approach helps ground these methodological points. Consider a hypothetical list attributed to Laodicea that excludes revelation. If that list is found only in late manuscripts from one monastic center, and if earlier or independent witnesses include revelation, then the omission probably reflects local liturgical preference or scribal loss. If instead, multiple early, geographically diverse witnesses omit the book, our confidence that some regions actually excluded revelation in practice increases. In the actual evidence, the pattern is mixed, hence the common historiographical conclusion that some Eastern communities were cautious about revelation, while the West moved toward inclusion earlier and more decisively. 8. Theological implications: authority, memory, and pastoral prudence. What should a Christian today draw from this tangled history? 3 theological implications are especially important. First, Christ's ultimate authority. The study of human councils and their canons can never displace the claim that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, Matthew 28:18. Councils embody delegated authority for ordering the life of the church, but they operate within a human and historical economy. Their decisions may be wise, mistaken, limited, or precisely suited to the pastoral problems they address. Recognizing their value does not make them the final court of appeal in every theological disagreement. Second, memory and humility. The episodic survival of canons teaches humility. Many practices regarded as normative today had a limited regional life in their origin. Conversely, some disciplines that now seem foreign were once sensible pastoral solutions. Historical humility invites charity across traditions. Where another Christian community preserves a different practice, our default posture should be curiosity and generosity rather than triumphal dismissal. Third, pastoral prudence. Pastoral rules address specific circumstances at particular times. That does not mean they are irrelevant when read charitably. It means that prudence is required to translate them into other contexts. The task of contemporary Christians is not to revive every ancient regulation wholesale, nor to dismiss all historical witness as irrelevant. It is to discern principles beneath the rules, care for the reputation of ministry, fidelity in public worship, protection of doctrinal integrity, and to apply those principles in ways faithful to Scripture and compassionate to persons. 9. Memory, identity, and the limits of retrospective judgment. A final, more pastoral observation. How we remember the past shapes our identity. Telling a dramatic story about erasure can feed present anxieties and sharp divisions.
But narrative force is not the same as historical warrant. We must resist the temptation to reconstruct history to serve contemporary polemics. The more appealing and clear-cut a story of erasure appears, the more skeptical we ought to be about it historically. This is not to deny that institutions sometimes suppress texts or limit access to ideas. There are historical instances of censorship and deliberate exclusion. But the evidence for a coordinated, long-term campaign to erase Laodicea's canons or any comparable provincial synod's decisions across the whole Christian world is lacking. What the evidence does show, repeatedly, is the contingency of textual and liturgical transmission, the role of regional practices in shaping local memory, and the slow, cumulative process by wider consensus emerged. 10. Practical steps for responsible study and pastoral use. If you are a pastor, teacher, or interested layperson who wants to engage this material responsibly, here are practical steps that flow from the evidence and from the pastoral mentality the sources themselves model. Read primary sources in context. When encountering a purported Laodicean rule quoted online or in a modern pamphlet, go to the manuscripts or critical editions when possible and check dates, provenance, and independent witnesses. Distinguish liturgical practice from doctrinal judgment. Ask whether a list functions as a lectionary or as a formal canonical statement. Appreciate local solutions. Ask what pastoral problem the rule addressed and whether that problem persists in your context. Avoid sensational narratives. If a claim of erasure depends on the absence of a single late manuscript, treat it with suspicion. Practice humility. Where the historical verdict is indefinito, honor the ambiguity and resist premature theological closure. Let theological convictions about Christ and Scripture guide the reading of history rather than the other way around. Historical discoveries inform faith. They do not supersede the apostolic witness. 11. Returning to Laodicea's example, a balanced summary. What then is the simplest honest summary we can offer about the Council of Laodicea in the secret rules that popular accounts sometimes claim were erased? The Council in Laodicea, a provincial synod in the later 4th century, issued practical canons addressing worship, clergy conduct, lay practice, and the public reading of texts. That fact is well within the bounds of what the documentary witnesses support. Some lists associated with Laodicea or its region show variations from later canonical lists, including instances where revelation is absent. That fact is also borne out by certain manuscript witnesses.
Whether the synod itself issued a definitive canonical list excluding Revelation is indefinito. The manuscript tradition is ambiguous, and alternative explanations, local liturgical practice, scribal omission, later compilation practices, are historically plausible. The disappearance of particular Laodicean phrases or practices from later common usage is best explained by the local character of synodal authority, by the vagaries of manuscript transmission, and by the slow consolidation of practice in larger ecclesiastical centers, not by a comprehensive, intentional erasure across the Christian world. Theologically, the Laodicean case underscores the need to balance respect for ecclesial authority with deference to Christ's ultimate lordship and with scholarly restraint where evidence is inconclusive. 12. A word on sources and further study. For those who wish to pursue the evidence directly, approach critical editions of canonical collections, editions of patristic citations, and studies of liturgical manuscripts. Look for resources that provide diplomatic transcriptions of the relevant manuscripts with careful attention to dates and codicological details. Comparative studies that chart the distribution of particular canons across geographic regions are especially helpful. And remember, secondary literature varies in quality. Preference should be given to sober, peer-reviewed scholarship that engages the sources transparently. 13. Closing pastoral exhortation. History can sharpen the mind and steady the soul when treated with honesty. The story of Laodicea is not an occasion for alarmist suspicion, but an invitation to deeper discernment. The bishops of Laodicea were pastors responding to concrete problems. Their rules bear the marks of pastoral love and human limitation. Some of their solutions fit the long story of the Church and helped shape the contours of Christian life. Others answered needs that later changed and were therefore set aside. Let that reality inform us in two ways. First, anchor confidence in the lordship of Christ, who is the Church's sure foundation, even when human decisions err or fade. Second, practice charity when judging historical authorities. The absence of a rule in our time is often a testimony to historical change, not to moral failure. Which forgotten practice surprised you most in this exploration? Share your thought below. Was it the rules about Sabbath and Sunday, the control of public reading, the restrictions on clerical commerce, or something else? I'd like to hear which detail reshapes your view of how the ancient church managed its life. Go and read the sources if you can, ask careful questions, and let history deepen rather than unsettle your faith. May the Lord, who holds all authority, guide our search for truth and our care for one another.